Hey guys, tonight we're unraveling a story that doesn't start with a bang, but with something far quieter and itchier. Imagine you're walking the crowded alleys of 1490s Naples. The city is alive with color and conflict, with merchants shouting over fig carts, clanging church bells echoing through stone courtyards, and soldiers stomping around like they own the place, which, unfortunately, they kind of do. War's in the air, but so is something else. Your fingers trail along a sun-warmed wall, and for a moment you feel a twinge on your skin. Nothing serious. A rash, maybe. Some red dots, like heat bumps. You probably just brushed against something. Or maybe you've been touched by the first whispers of a disease no one understands yet. A disease that would come to be called the Great Pox. A disease that would change the face of Europe literally and figuratively for centuries. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I'd love to know who's drifting off with me tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start to hear murmurs, not from the plague doctors just yet, but from soldiers, specifically French soldiers, because when they sacked Naples in 1495, they brought home more than loot. Men who had fought and pillaged began showing signs of something new. Their skin broke out, their bones ached, their mouths erupted in sores. And soon horror of horrors, their faces and bodies started to collapse into a map of boils, ulcers, and open wounds. Mainstream fact: the first well-documented outbreak of syphilis in Europe occurred in 1495 during the Italian Wars. Soldiers returning from these battles spread the disease rapidly throughout the continent. At first, people didn't know what to call it. Some called it the French disease, blame the soldiers, the Neapolitan disease, blame the Italians, or the Spanish disease, blame literally anyone else. Basically, it was a giant Renaissance version of not it. And what did it look like? Well, the early strains were brutal, far more aggressive than the slower-burning syphilis we know today. It could ravage a person's body in weeks, turning skin to sludge, and sometimes causing death within months. There were stories hushed, half-believed, of entire brothels emptying out overnight, of men with their noses falling off, of babies born with teeth. Fringe tidbit: some early writers genuinely believed the disease was punishment from God for the fall of Granada, the expulsion of the Jews, or even the discovery of the New World. Take your pick. Renaissance Europe had a buffet of existential guilt. Historians still argue whether syphilis originated in the New World or had been lurking in Europe already, undiagnosed and unnamed. One theory, known as the Columbian exchange theory, suggests that sailors brought it back from the Americas, with them alongside tobacco, potatoes, and just a sprinkle of horrific, incurable disease. Others argue the disease mutated in Europe itself, evolving into something new under the pressure of post-war conditions and increased mobility. But here's the thing: you don't know any of this, standing in Naples in 1495. You just know your joints ache. You know you feel shame, though you don't quite know why. You try to cover your face with a scarf. You avoid your lover's eyes. You avoid mirrors entirely. And you wait. You wait to see if it passes. It doesn't. You walk the streets slower now. You see others with the same shuffle, the same slumped shoulders. No one talks about it openly. Not yet, but you see the glances, the quiet recoil. You hear a mother pull her child close when you pass. No one wants to catch it. No one knows how. And soon, the blame games begin in earnest. Physicians start scribbling notes, drawing diagrams of the human body like road maps with detours into madness. Herbalists brew potions. Barbers offer bloodletting. Everyone swears they know someone who was cured with goat, fat, river, water, or prayer. Meanwhile, the disease spreads. It follows trade routes, seeps into cities, clings to the hems of travelers and the backs of horses, and all the while, it evolves, not just biologically, but symbolically. This isn't just a sickness. It's a story, a warning, a moral lesson. You don't know yet how deep it will run, how long it will last, how many lives it will reshape, disfigure, or end. You just know this rash? It's the beginning. You leave the clean, polished corridors of modern medicine far behind, stepping into the Renaissanceian age of dazzling progress and ghastly ignorance all tangled together like vines on a crumbling statue. Imagine cobbled streets underfoot, perfume masking the stench of unwashed humanity, and wigs as common as bread. It's beautiful on the surface, but just beneath it, something is festering. You see, syphilis doesn't explode into this world with quiet discretion. No, it arrives like a trumpet blaster, maybe more like a brass band marching down the street with banners reading, "Surprise! Your body's about to betray you." The late 15th century brings this new, grotesque guest to Europe, and people don't know what to call it yet, but they know they're scared. The sores come first, painful, unmistakable, and impossible to hide. Then comes the fever, the muscle pain, the fatigue. And then, when you think it's done, it digs deeper into your bones, your nerves, your brain. Hair falls out in clumps, noses collapse, tongues swell. Historians still argue whether the early Renaissance strain was particularly vicious, or whether accounts were just more dramatic than clinical. But there's no denying one thing: it left people terrified. Mainstream fact: the first major outbreak of what we now call syphilis swept through Europe in the late 1490s, with a particularly infamous case among French troops during their invasion of Naples. It spread like wildfire among soldiers, merchants, lovers, and even monks. Within a decade, it had earned nicknames in nearly every language. The English blamed the French. The French blamed the Italians. The Italians blamed the Spanish. And so on. Everyone agreed it was foreign. And no one wanted to admit how quickly it was becoming domestic. You picture it now. A young merchant returning from Naples. He doesn't look sick. Not yet, but there's a tenderness at his groin he can't explain. He visits a barber sojourner cheerful man with more access to leeches than logic. The treatment begins with a cut, then a cauterization, then a paste of mercury, smeared generously like jam on toast. The man goes home hopeful. 2 weeks later, his tongue swells until he can barely breathe. Quirky tidbit. Mercury was the go-to treatment for syphilis for centuries. Yes, mercury as in the liquid metal we now know is toxic enough to ban from thermometers. Doctors would mix it into ointments or even prescribe it in pill form. Some patients were wrapped in mercury-laced cloth and placed near fires to sweat the disease out. Others had it injected. Side effects included tooth loss, neurological damage, tremors, and yes, death. But hey, sometimes it made the sores fade, for a while. The Renaissance is full of contradictions. Artists are discovering anatomy with breathtaking detail, Michelangelo carving muscle into marble like it's clay, Leonardo da Vinci sketching the human form with eerie precision. And yet, the actual doctors? Still stuck between superstition and trial-by-fire medicine. They argue over whether syphilis is a punishment from God, a poison of the humours, or something you catch from looking at the wrong person too long. In university halls, learned men debate whether it came from the New World or had simply lain dormant until now. Some whisper that syphilis was the price Europe paid for colonial expansion. Others, more cautiously, suggest it might have always existed in milder forms and just evolved. But no one can deny its power now. It ruins faces. It ends legacies. It drives the afflicted mad. You wander into a small, tiled room in a Florentine hospital, the smell of lavender water barely masking the coppery tang of blood. A noble woman lies there, her skin pale but her eyes wild. She's had the disease for years, passed unknowingly from her first husband. Now, married to a wealthy silk merchant, her status buys her the best treatments, mercury baths, wine-soaked compresses, leeching every full moon. Her mind has started to slip. She speaks to people who aren't there. She says the Virgin Mary sits beside her bed and cries. Her husband still hopes for a cure. Her maid knows better. Historians still argue whether the psychological symptoms of late-stage syphilis, especially hallucinations and delusions, were fully understood at the time. Some Renaissance physicians documented cases of madness linked to the pox, but others blamed it on demonic possession or divine punishment. What's clear is that the disease was never just physical. It eroded identity, it stained reputations, and it lingered. Reputation, after all, mattered deeply in this era of masks and manners. A single visible sore could doom you socially, professionally, even spiritually. Some victims wore silk veils or painted their lesions with elaborate makeup. Wealthy men might disappear from public life, claiming gout or melancholy. Courtesans simply vanished. Some were buried in mass graves. Others were quietly institutionalized out of sight, out of shame. You picture a portrait now. A stately gentleman, lace at his collar, one hand resting on a skull to signal his philosophical depth. You notice a small, puckered scar near his lip. The artist left it there on purpose. A hidden message, maybe, or a warning. Look closer. The plague of beauty is sometimes invisible. You sit by the fire in a grand manner, listening to hushed conversation. A poet has just died, and the whispers are brutal. He drank too much, one says. He went mad, offers another. But the real story is written in the locked drawer upstairs, letters from a lover who begged him to seek help. A diary that tracks the slow erosion of his health. A final entry written in a shaky, barely legible hand. I am no longer myself. Syphilis in the Renaissance isn't just a disease. It's a story of denial, of desire, of medical experimentation tangled with moral panic. It shaped how people thought about sin, about secrecy, about the body itself, and yet it never stopped people from loving, from hoping, from seeking remedies in gardens, temples, apothecaries, and prayer. The candles burn lower. The air is thick with resin and wax. You can hear the rustle of a physician's cloak, the splash of a ladle, the murmur of another hopeful cure being stirred. And above it all, the echo of a question that haunted the Renaissance and, if we're honest, still lingers. Is this a punishment or just nature? The town square is alive with music, two-night lutes strumming, laughter echoing, dancers weaving among torchlit stalls. But you're not here for merriment. You're here to follow the footsteps of a disease, and that trail runs straight through this crowd, under the silks and smiles, hidden behind painted cheeks and carefully arranged wigs. Because even in moments of celebration, the great plague of syphilis walks quietly among the revelers. You brush shoulders with a merchant whose hands tremble slightly as he counts coins. A nobleman nearby dabs at his lips, checking for blood. A musician coughs into his sleeve and hides the stain. This is what syphilis looks like during its middle stage, no longer explosive, no longer deniable, but steady and cruel. The disease has passed through the skin now. It's deeper. It has infiltrated the blood, the bones, the nerves, and the symptoms, though less dramatic than the initial sores, are often worse. Aching joints, hair loss, bouts of fever, strange rashes that bloom and vanish like whispers. Even stranger are the episodes of confusion, of blurred vision, of words slipping away mid-sentence. You watch a magistrate forget his own name during a council meeting. His aides smile politely and say he's just tired. Mainstream fact: syphilis unfolds in stages primary, secondary, latent, and finally tertiary if left untreated. In the Renaissance, most victims didn't live long enough to reach the final stage, but the secondary stage was a common nightmare. It could last weeks, months, or even longer, causing widespread lesions, swollen lymph nodes, and neurological symptoms, and since the disease mimicked many others, it was often misdiagnosed. You follow a woman down an alley, know her shoes clicking against worn stones, her dress too fine for the neighborhood. She's a courtesan, respected in her way, feared in others. In her satchel are sachets of herbs and a tiny vial of mercury ointment. She knows the risks. She's seen what it did to her friend Anna, who used to sing but now stares at walls. But work is work, and there are no other options. Quirky tidbit. In Venice, a city bursting with trade and temptation, officials once tried to establish a brothel district far from noble quarters to contain the pox. It didn't work. Diseases, like secrets, have a way of slipping past walls, but the effort created a strange new urban phenomenon: red light districts that, in some cities, lasted for centuries. Historians still argue whether prostitution was the primary driver of syphilis's spread or just the easiest target. Some records suggest the disease moved just as swiftly through married households, military camps, and monastic communities. One thing is certain, though the Renaissance loved to blame. And the blame almost always pointed at women. You find yourself in a small apothecary now. The air smells of vinegar, dried rose petals, and something metallic. A young man sits by the window, his hands wrapped in cloth. He's too ashamed to speak. The healer doesn't ask questions. She prepares a tonic wine steeped with herbs, mixed with something thick and red. He drinks, he coughs, he thanks her with coin and silence. Outside, rumors swirl like smoke. Some say syphilis is a curse from God for mankind's arrogance. Others claim it's a test. A few even whisper that it's a punishment specifically for artists, for dreamers, for those who live too far outside the rules. You think of Caravaggio, his brilliance and his brawls, his abrupt vanishing from Rome. His letters mention illness, his paintings grow darker. Maybe he was one of the afflicted, and maybe that shadow followed his brush. You walk along a canal. A poet recites verses to no one in particular. His words are strange, fragmented, beautiful. You suspect he's not entirely here anymore, that the disease has crept into his mind. It happens slowly, like fog rolling over a field. First, forgetfulness, then paranoia, then hallucinations. Some victims report seeing demons, others, angels. Some think they're already dead. A child clutches her mother's hand near the water. Her cheeks are pale, and she walks stiffly. You wonder if she was born this way, if something deeper is at play. Congenital syphilis was not uncommon. If a mother was infected, her baby might be stillborn. If not, the child might suffer from blindness, deafness, or skeletal deformities. Many didn't live past infancy. Those who did often carried the scars for life. You stop by a church. It's quiet. The priest inside is old, half-blind, and muttering a prayer you don't recognize. He once heard hundreds of confessions, he says. But lately, fewer people come. They're afraid, he explains. Afraid they won't be forgiven, or afraid it won't matter. You sit with him for a while. The sun filters through stained glass, casting blue and gold across the floor. He tells you a story of a girl who left her village to be cured. She returned a year later, no longer speaking. The doctor called it a miracle, he says, but it felt more like silence. You step outside. The air is cool now. The crowd in the square has thinned. Lanterns flicker. You realize that syphilis in the Renaissance wasn't just a disease of the body. It was a disease of visibility, of shame, of names whispered instead of spoken aloud. People didn't just suffer, they disappeared. But still, they lived, they loved, they worked, they left letters and poems and painted their faces. They kept trying. Even as their bodies betrayed them, they looked for answers, for mercy, for each other. You sit on a stone bench and breathe. The city is quiet. Somewhere, a bell tolls. And still, the plague walks. Morning arrives not with fanfare, but with fog soft and thick as wool, clinging to the edges of every street and statue. You step into the grey light of another city, another year, another chapter, in this long, unrelenting history of a disease that's both everywhere and nowhere. This time, the architecture has changed. The walls are straighter, the clothes stiffer, the wigs taller. You've wandered into the heart of Baroque Europe now, where opulence has become a kind of armor. The plague hasn't left off course not, but it's gotten better at wearing makeup. In these grand salons and powdered corridors, syphilis is no longer whispered about only in dark alleys. It's danced around in operas, referenced in satire, and mocked in pamphlets passed hand to hand at banquets. But underneath the jokes, the powdered faces, and the ruffles, the illness is just as devastating as ever. You step into a drawing room. A woman reclines on a chaise longue, her cheeks flushed from rouge and fever. She holds a fan in one hand and a medical pamphlet in the other. The pamphlet claims to offer a cure. So does the apothecary across the street. So do at least 5 doctors in the city, each peddling their own brand of hope, some gentler, some more brutal. Mainstream fact. By the 17th century, mercury was still the dominant treatment for syphilis. It could be taken orally, rubbed on the skin, or inhaled as vapor. The phrase, "a night in the arms of Venus leads to a lifetime on Mercury," became a bitter joke among the afflicted. The irony? Mercury poisoning shared many symptoms with the disease itself: tremors, memory loss, mood swings, and early death. You watch a physician mix a silver paste behind a privacy screen. His gloves are thin, his confidence thinner. His patient, a nobleman in his 30s, has begun to lose his teeth. His hands tremble when he writes. Still, he hosts parties. Still, he poses for portraits, because image, here, is everything. Outside, a line forms at the infirmary. The poor have no portraits, no privacy screens, just hope. The physician there dabs a child's rash with vinegar and prays it's something else. Sometimes, it is. Often, it isn't. You walk down cobbled streets past ornate facades. On one, a small plaque is carved into the wall and ear, delicately shaped. A remnant of older beliefs, perhaps. A place where people once whispered their suffering. Now, people walk past it without noticing. Quirky tidbit. In some cities, special houses were established for incurables, those who had progressed too far to be saved. These weren't always grim places. Some had music, gardens, even poetry readings. One in Paris was nicknamed the House of Gentle Departure, but they were also final stops. No one left cured. Historians still argue whether this era's obsession with appearances made the disease worse. Did wigs and makeup help hide the symptoms so well that it spread faster? Or did the visibility of decline collapsing nobles, actors forgetting Linus, eventually force people to act? There's no consensus, just records and gravestones. You pause at a fountain. A young woman dips a cloth in the water and dabs it behind her ears. She's murmuring something, maybe a prayer, maybe a recipe. Her brother stands beside her, eyes distant. His jacket sleeve hides a bandage. They don't speak as they leave, but they move in sync, like they've been practicing this choreography for months. Doctor, rest, potion, prayer, repeat. In a theatre nearby, an actor prepares for the stage. His costume is resplendent. His body? Less so. He coughs between lines. He blinks too much. But he knows the show must go on because fame is fleeting. and work is scarce, and illness is expensive. You sit in the back row and watch. The play is a comedy, full of mistaken identities and flirtation. But you notice how many characters fall ill, how many jokes hinge on bodily weakness, on love gone wrong. The audience laughs. Some cough. After the performance, the actors bow. You slip out before the applause ends. Behind the theatre, in a narrow lane, a painted door stands slightly ajar. You step inside. The walls are lined with remedy potions in blue glass, dried herbs in silk sachets, bundles of rolled parchment. An old woman sits at the center, stirring something thick and silver. She doesn't look up. They ask for a cure, she says. But most don't want the truth. Just comfort. Just the feeling that someone's trying. She points to a corner where worn shoes are stacked in rows. Those are theirs, the ones who didn't come back. You leave quietly. Outside, the fog has lifted a little. Not completely. Just enough to see the spire of a nearby church, the outline of a hospital, the slow movement of people who don't yet know they're sick. You realize something. Syphilis wasn't just a disease of the poor or promiscuous. It was a disease of proximity, of vulnerability, of being human. A cough here, a kiss there. An embrace, a handshake, a slip of memory. You step into a carriage, now imaginary or real. It hardly matters and feel the city breathe around you. No alarms, no sirens. Just the rustle of skirts, the clatter of hooves, the heartbeat of a time trying very hard not to look too closely at itself. But the disease looks. It always does. You arrive in a darker corner of the Renaissance, now not the gilded courts or candlelit theatres, but the places history doesn't visit as often, the underground layers, the hidden rooms, the spaces between the lines. There's a convent on a hillside, ivy-covered and hushed. From outside, it looks peaceful. Birds wheel above it. The wind hums softly through the stone arches. But inside, it's a different story. This isn't a place for prayer alone. It's a place for containment, for recovery, for quiet suffering. You walk the narrow halls, feet echoing against worn tiles. The scent of lavender tries to mask something metallic underneath. You pass a small room where a nun tends to a girl no older than 15. Her eyes are closed. Her breath is shallow. There's a rosary on the table. Next to it, a bowl of crushed herbs. Mainstream fact. By the late Renaissance, syphilis had reached even the most isolated communities. Nuns, monks, and novices people assumed to live chaste, cloistered lives were not immune. Some contracted it through charity work, tending to the sick, others through abuse, or through stories darker than the records ever write down. The convent isn't alone. All over Europe, hospitals began creating secret wards. Not officially designated for syphilis, of course. That would be bad for reputation, but they existed. Quiet rooms, back corridors, isolated cells. Here, treatment could be given without drawing attention, and here, many were left to die without ever being named. You slip into one of these rooms. It's small. There's a basin, a cot, and a single window the size of your hand. Carved into the wooden frame is a series of crosses, counting days, prayers. No one knows. The girl lying on the cot stirs. Her skin is pale, lips cracked, but her eyes open, and for a moment they lock with yours. You say nothing. She says nothing. But in that silence, something ancient and human is exchanged. The knowledge of pain, the endurance of it. Quirky tidbit. Some convents develop their own herbal treatments for syphilis, completely separate from the mainstream mercury approach. One in southern Italy swore by a mixture of garlic, fig syrup, and olive oil. Another claimed spiritual healing through music and fasting. None of them worked reliably, but they offered ritual, structure, and dignity. Sometimes, That was enough. Historians still argue whether these enclaves of silent care were acts of mercy or social avoidance. Were the afflicted hidden away to protect them, or to shield others from the shame of their condition? Maybe both. Maybe neither. What is certain is that these places became their own ecosystems of grief and grace. You leave the convent and step into a rain-slick alley. The city below is still stirring. Markets opening, bells tolling, voices calling out bread and figs and fish. Life goes on, even when decay is baked into the bricks. A man walks past you, limping slightly. His boots are polished, but the toe is cracked. His coat is fine, but one sleeve hangs loosely empty. He tips his hat as he passes. There's a tremor in his hand. You follow him from a distance, through winding streets and into a public bathhouse. Not for pleasure, but for hope. In the tiled chamber, steam rises from heated pools. Herbal scents swirl in the airtime, camphor, mint. Men and women soak, quietly, their faces tired. Most are here not for cleanliness, but for healing. In the corner, a barber surgeon sharpens his tools. Bloodletting was still common, especially for venereal disturbances. He chats easily with his client, who's trying not to flinch. They both pretend it's normal. It kind of is. You watch a young boy slip into a side pool, guided by his older brother. The boy's back is marked with lesions. The brother hums a lullaby. They both pretend it's just a rash. Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. That's the thing about syphilis. It doesn't knock loudly. It creeps. First a sore, then a rash. Then 1,000 tiny betrayals of the body. Memory loss, hallucinations, slurred speech, collapse. A slow undoing. You sit near the steam vents and close your eyes. The warmth is comforting, but you know this comfort is temporary, like the treatments, like the lies people tell themselves to get through another day. You open your eyes again in a pharmacy. The air smells of dust and crushed petals. Rows of ceramic jars line the walls, painted with Latin names and mythical creatures. A young woman presses a coin into the hand of the apothecary. He doesn't look at her. He passes her a small tin wrapped in ribbon. "Twice a day," he says. She nods, then leaves quickly, without making eye contact with anyone. You peek at the jar closest to you. It's labeled Unguentum ex Mercurio. No instructions, no warnings, just the old promise in Latin, omnia per aurum et sanguinem, all through gold and blood. You walk out as a storm begins to break. The streets darken. A bell tolls from the nearby tower, not for death, just for the hour. Still, it feels ominous. You pass a small statue near the fountain. A saint, maybe, or a protector of the sick. At the base, someone has left a flower, wilted, but still present. You sit on the edge of the fountain and watch the rain turn the square into a mirror. Reflections ripple, windows glow. Somewhere behind you, a violin begins to play. The notes drift through the storm, light as breath. And you wonder how many prayers were whispered during this time. No, for cures. Not even for miracles, but just for one more day of dignity. One more morning with the face still whole, the hands still steady, the mind still your own. The violin plays on. The rain has passed now, leaving the city washed and gleaming, cobblestones dark with memory. You walk beneath dripping eaves, your fingers trailing against the damp stone. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once, then falls silent. The streets are quieter now, just the shuffle of shoes, the low murmur of a distant tavern, and the whisper of your own thoughts echoing off the walls. You turn a corner and step into a district that once pulsed with life, but now feels uneasy. Not empty, no. People still live here. But it's the kind of place where curtains don't stir and doors close just a little too quickly behind you. These were once homes to the rising class. Lawyers, clerks, artists, and scholars, people with ambition and secrets. And here, syphilis found another of its many masks: madness. Mainstream fact. In its final stage, syphilis often attacks the nervous system. Neurosyphilis, as it's now known, was almost entirely misunderstood during the Renaissance. Victims were accused of possession, lunacy, melancholia. The term general paresis of the insane wouldn't appear until centuries later. But the symptoms paranoia, tremors, hallucinations were all too real. You approach a brick house with a tarnished bronze knocker. It's been repurposed as a private asylum now. Not official. Nothing is official here. But families bring loved ones here quietly when their behavior becomes too strange to explain at dinner. When the polite world no longer makes room. Inside, it's quiet. Not with peace, but with restraint. A man paces along a narrow hallway. He wears a scholar's robe, frayed at the cuffs. On the wall beside him, he's drawn diagrams in charcoal, circles, stars, the occasional Latin phrase. His gaze flickers when he sees you. He smiles, vaguely, and continues walking the same 10 steps, over and over. His name, you're told, was once respected. A philosopher, possibly. He began speaking to statues, then to the sky, then to people who weren't there. And always the same refrain: "My thoughts have been stolen." You sit in a side room where two women whisper to one another. One knits with frantic energy, the other chews her sleeve. Both pause when the door creaks open, then return to their rhythm. This is their sanctuary now. Their minds, misfiring and rearranged, still hold flickers of who they were. Quirky tidbit. One Renaissance physician claimed that patients suffering from neurosyphilis could be reversed if made to stare at spinning wheels while listening to chanting. His clinic had 3 rooms each painted a different color with wheels mounted on every wall. The treatment was not successful. Historians still argue whether many infamous mad figures of the Renaissance tormented poets, raving prophets, even some supposed saints were suffering from untreated syphilis. Was their genius genuine? Or was it the long reach of a silent disease pulling at their minds? You leave the house slowly. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows down the narrow alleyways. You pass a shop selling masks, bright, grotesque things meant for carnival. You stop and stare at them for a while. There's a strange poetry in it. People wearing masks to dance and laugh while hiding the marks underneath. A kind of collective agreement to ignore the sickness and keep the music going. You step into a square where a man recites poems for coin. His voice is cracked but charming. He sees you, bows dramatically, and begins a sonnet. It's about a lover who vanishes at night, leaving only a silk ribbon behind. The crowd chuckles knowingly, then disperses. But as he turns away, you notice the stiffness in his gait, the way he winces with every step. You wonder how many artists lived this way, painting, sculpting, writing while their bodies betrayed them. Mainstream fact. Several Renaissance geniuses are now suspected to have suffered from syphilis, though confirmation is impossible. Caravaggio, for instance, was known for wild mood swings and erratic behavior, traits that some researchers now interpret as neurological symptoms. And then there's Benvenuto Cellini, sculptor, goldsmith, and writer. In his own autobiography, he describes bizarre ailments and a corruption of the flesh. Historians debate whether it was syphilis, arsenic poisoning, or something else entirely. But whatever it was, it shaped his life and his art. You pass a church next, small, quiet, but the door is open, and candlelight glows inside. You step in and sit in the back pew. At the altar, a priest speaks softly to an old man who's crying not loudly, not theatrically, just tears, quietly falling into his hands. You think of how many prayers must have been whispered like that during this time. Not for salvation, not even for forgiveness, but for understanding. For answers that never quite came. Quirky tidbit. Some Renaissance churches had side chapels unofficially nicknamed the Weeper's Corners. These were places people could sit unseen behind screens or pillars and just grieve. No confessions, no sermons, just silence. You light a candle before leaving, pressing a coin into the donation box. As the flame flickers, you feel the moment stretch not holy, not supernatural, but still sacred. Outside, the air smells of roasted chestnuts and damp stone. The night is coming. You pass a group of musicians tuning their instruments. One of them has lesions on his neck, barely covered by his collar. He meets your gaze and nods once, like he knows you know. Then he begins to play. A lullaby, maybe, or just something slow and mournful. You sit on a nearby step and listen. Because sometimes that's all you can do. Morning returns, but it's the kind of dawn that brings no real comfort. The sky is pale and bleached out, like parchment left too long in the sun. You walk through a quieter quarter now, where the streets are narrower and the shutters never open all the way. Even the birds seem hesitant, their songs brief and uncertain. You wrap your coat tighter, though the chill isn't from the air, it's from what lingers in these walls. This was once the heart of the medical district, or at least what passed for medicine in the Renaissance. Here, apothecaries offered tinctures in delicate glass vials, and barber surgeons practiced the terrifying art of bloodletting, with razors that never quite looked clean. And in back rooms and locked cellars, plague doctors and syphilis specialists whispered their diagnoses behind closed doors. You step into one of these old clinics, the wood floors creak, and the shelves sag with dried herbs, most of them long since dead. A faded anatomical diagram curls in a frame, showing a man with his insides exposed like a morbid flower. There's something reverent in the quiet here. A kind of haunted respect for the desperate, determined people who tried to heal when they barely understood what they were fighting. Mainstream fact: Renaissance treatments for syphilis were wide, ranging, and wildly ineffective. The most famous was mercury. It was applied topically, swallowed, inhaled as vapor, and even injected. One popular phrase at the time was, "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." It was supposed to be ironic. Mostly, it was just tragic. You glance at a case of instruments. Metal rods, small saws, hooks. There's a little bowl, still stained red-brown with something that looks suspiciously like dried blood. One of the tools is labeled in Latin, for treating buboes. You decide not to touch anything. Quirky tidbit. Some healers believed syphilis could be driven out by sweat. They'd wrap patients in layers of hot blankets, place them in steam-filled rooms, and wait for the bad humors to escape. The result? Dehydration, burns, and often unconsciousness. But Avery 1 left a little thinner. Historians still argue whether any treatments in the period were actually effective, or if the rare recoveries were just the body's natural cycle. Some point to guaiac wood, imported from the New World, which showed mild promise. Others dismiss it as just another placebo wrapped in exotic marketing. You leave the clinic and continue down the cobblestones. A cart rolls by, its wheels squeaking. On it lie bundles of linen, faintly spotted. Hospital laundry, perhaps? Or the belongings of someone who won't be needing them anymore. At the corner, you find a narrow shop with painted signs, golden suns, moons, and a serpent biting its own tail. An alchemist's mark. You step inside. The man behind the counter is stooped, his beard tucked into his belt. He watches you like a librarian watches a child near an open flame. On his shelves are bottles labeled in spidery Latin, elixir of Jupiter's gaze, salve of quiet blood, tears of Saturn. You pick one up. It rattles. He smiles faintly. "For the plague of lovers," he says. then shrugs. But it doesn't work. You nod and set it down. Mainstream fact. Quacks and alchemists thrived in the Renaissance. The lack of centralized medical authority meant that anyone with a tincture and a convincing voice could set up shop. Some believed diseases like syphilis were punishments from Venus. Others thought they were caused by too much passion or by the moon. One particularly ambitious theory involved lunar vapor passing through bad dreams. You buy nothing, but thank the man anyway. He bows like he's blessing you. As you step back onto the street, the bell above the door jingles like a warning. You find yourself thinking about the patients, the ones who had hope, who tried everything, who drank mercury, burned herbs, slept beneath copper mirrors, who believed that if they just tried hard enough, the sickness would retreat. You arrive at a courtyard with a fountain in the middle. The water trickles faintly. A woman kneels beside it, washing her hands longer than seems necessary. Her fingers are cracked. Her eyes meet yours, and she nods not in greeting, but in shared knowledge. This disease touched everyone, the rich, the poor, the faithful, the cynical. You sit on the edge of the fountain, watch the water ripple over time-worn stone. You remember something from earlier about how some doctors thought the spirit could be purified by sound. So hospitals hired musicians to play soft, repeating melodies outside the wards. Flutes, lutes, the occasional harp. You listen now not for music, but for memory. And it's everywhere. In the creak of wood, the scent of lavender, the whisper of water over stone. Quirky tidbit. In Venice, one particularly eccentric healer built a musical chamber in his house. He believed the vibrations of the right notes could drive out disease. Patients would lie on the floor while he played what he called cleansing symphonies. No one got better, but some claimed their dreams were more beautiful. You rise. Finally, the air is changing again. Clouds drift in, slow and grey. The wind carries the scent of rain and salt, even though the sea is far away. You walk past a row of statues, their faces worn blank by centuries of wind. You wonder if they ever had names, or if they were always meant to be anonymous silent watchers of a world that struggled to explain what was happening to its own body. There's a final plaque by the archway as you exit the district. The lettering is faded, but still legible. To those who suffered without blame, and to those who tried to heal them. You pause, read it twice, then keep walking. You leave the fountain behind, and continue walking through the narrowing streets. The architecture changes, stone becomes plaster, arches become beams, and the colors fade into muted yellows and grays. You're no longer in the bustling heart of a Renaissance city. This is its forgotten fringe, a place where people were sent to vanish quietly. Not criminals, not the damned, just the sick. This was the quarantine zone. You reach a low wall, crumbling in places, ivy curling through its cracks. Beyond it lies a structure that once served as a lazaretto and isolation hospital. The doors creak open with a little pressure, and you step inside. Dust swirls in shafts of filtered light. The floor is tiled in rough, uneven patterns. There's no sound but your breath, and the faint rasp of time rubbing away at history. The layout is simple. Long wards, narrow beds, walls that still echo with muffled coughs and whispered prayers. Here is where the syphilitic poor were sent, when treatments failed and symptoms became too visible to ignore. Swollen joints, weeping sores, minds unraveled by fevers and grief. Mainstream fact. Syphilis was so feared during the Renaissance that entire facilities were built solely to contain it. These weren't always medical sanctuaries. Some were closer to prisons. Entry was easy, just a note from a physician. Leaving, however, was rare. Recovery wasn't expected. Management was the goal. You walk past a row of iron-framed cots. Some still have the ghosts of linens draped over them, thin as breath, brittle as fallen leaves. You imagine a woman lying there, early 20s, maybe? She once danced in a square you passed earlier. Her nose is gone now. Her eyes flicker with fever. She clutches a scrap of lace someone snuck in, holding on to dignity in a place that's already taken most of it. Quirky tidbit. To combat the miasma, or bad air thought to spread the disease, staff often burned bundles of rosemary and thyme. Some wore sachets of crushed petals under their clothes. One hospital even installed a giant copper rose on its roof, hoping it would absorb the illness floating through the air. It didn't, but it did make the place smell faintly like a perfumed forge. Historians still argue whether quarantine policies saved lives or just delayed death. Some claim these facilities reduced the spread. Others point to the abysmal conditions, poor nutrition, and rampant mistreatment inside. In cities where outbreaks surged, the line between humane care and bureaucratic disposal often blurred. You move deeper into the building. There's a chapel at the far end, small and windowless. The altar is plain. The pews are carved with names, dates, initials, etched in lonely hands. One message reads, "Tell my mother I slept." Another simply, "Not cursed, just sick." You sit for a while on one of the benches. The air is cool here, heavy. You imagine the chapel once filled with voices, some singing, some weeping, some just breathing quietly together. That's what people did when medicine ran out. They gathered, they waited, they hoped the gods would notice what the doctors couldn't fix. You rise and head toward a side room, a former storeroom, judging by the remnants, broken jars, splintered crates, an old chest lined with lead to preserve medicines that have long since turned to powder. You find a set of patient records tucked in a drawer, names, ages, symptoms, notes in shaky Latin. Some files are stained with something dark, others are unsigned perhaps to shield families from shame. Shame. It's a word that lingers, unspoken but ever present in syphilis history. For centuries, it wasn't just the disease that destroyed people, it was the judgment, the insinuations, the whispered gossip behind closed shutters. Syphilis was called the punishment disease, the great pox, the mark of sin. The affliction had a morality tale baked into its bones. But if you look closely, truly look, you'll see that most sufferers were just people, lonely, afraid, often poor. Many were infected not through scandal, but through marriage, childbirth, or desperate decisions. No one asked for it. Few were prepared. You step back outside. The sun has lowered, casting gold across the courtyard. You pass a nurse's station, where faded ledgers list meal rations. One crust, one broth, one prayer. Some days, maybe that was enough. Quirky tidbit. In one Florentine lazaretto, an eccentric healer believed laughter could slow the disease. He hired a troupe of actors to perform shadow plays behind linen screens. Once a week, the patients gathered shaking, sometimes blind and watch stories unfold in silhouette. The laughter, they said, hurt, but they came anyway. You walk toward the back garden, overgrown now, but you see traces of care. Lavender bushes, a single peach tree, gnarled and stooped but still bearing fruit. Maybe it was planted by a patient who needed something to hope for, or maybe a nurse, tired of death, wanted to offer something sweet in the end. You pick up a fallen peach, bruised and warm. It smells like sun and sap and late summer. You don't eat it, but you hold it, and it feels like a kind of offering. At the far wall, there's a plaque. The inscription has worn down, but you can make out one line. For those who lived quietly and died gently. You stand in the garden a little longer. The wind rustles through the branches. For once, it doesn't sound like mourning. It sounds like breath. You leave the lazaretto garden behind, your shoes brushing against loose gravel and cracked cobblestone as you re-enter the city's winding lanes. The streets are quieter, now twilight has set in. You pass a candlelit window where someone is boiling water in a copper kettle. and for a moment, it's easy to pretend everything is fine, that there's no plague, no rot beneath the velvet of Renaissance progress. But then you hear it again, the low wheeze of someone coughing behind a shuttered door. You turn away and head toward the medical quarter, where the scent of dried herbs lingers in the air, and the doorways are marked with the signs of the learned caduceus carvings, small golden suns, bundles of lavender strung above the lintels. Here, physicians made their best attempts to fight syphilis, and here is where many failed. Mainstream fact: Renaissance doctors believed in balancing the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile to maintain health. Syphilis didn't fit neatly into that system, so they adapted. Some prescribed mercury, both as ointments and vapor treatments. Others used guaiac wood from the New World, boiling it into foul teas. A few resorted to bloodletting, leeches, or endless purges. Results were mixed. You duck into an apothecary's workshop restored, now part of a museum, but still filled with the smells of dried roots and rusted metal, mortars and pestles, glass jars labelled in spidery Latin, a narrow cot in the back, where a desperate patient might have spent a fevered night breathing in mercury fumes, convinced they were healing while their lungs quietly failed. One wall features preserved case notes, copied from real Renaissance physicians. They read more like confessions than medical charts. Patient cannot speak, tongue blackened, wife now infected, prognosis bleak, or simply applied mercury, awaiting God's answer. You wince. Mercury, the so-called silver cure. It was used for centuries, despite being incredibly toxic. Doctors noticed that patients who drooled, sweat excessively, or developed painful ulcers sometimes showed temporary improvement, so they assumed it worked. Never mind that it poisoned their kidneys and corroded their minds. Quirky tidbit: there was a popular saying among 16th century barbers, "A night with Venus brings a lifetime with Mercury." Witty, sure, but also grimly accurate. The cure might last longer than the disease. Historians still argue whether the use of mercury did more harm than good. Some believe it slowed the progression of symptoms in early stages. Others think it only masked, then prolonging suffering, confusing diagnosis, and ultimately worsening outcomes. The real tragedy? There were voices even then, warning against it. But they were few, and far too quiet. You pass through a chamber once used for patient education. A mural depicts the progression of syphilis in stages: healthy flesh, turning blotchy, cracked, and finally skeletal. It was meant to terrify, to force early treatment, to encourage discretion. Instead, it haunted dreams and whispered through alleyways like a ghost. In a corner lies a wooden mannequin, half disassembled, used for anatomy lessons. Its joints are stiff, its painted face peeling. But beneath its feet, someone carved 2 words into the plinth. Still listening, you pause. Maybe it was a student, maybe a patient. But the sentiment echoes what you felt throughout this journey, even when silenced, even when suffering people wanted to be heard. You step back outside. Night has fallen fully now. The stars overhead look the same as they did 500 years ago. That's the strangest thing. For all the bloodletting and burning, the prayers and poisons, the desperate scribbles in casebooks, the stars just kept turning. You walk along the Arno River, its surface glimmering with torchlight and the reflections of stone bridges. In this city of palaces and plagues, art still bloomed, music still played. Lovers still whispered in doorways. The sickness didn't stop life, it just shadowed it, like a soft, constant reminder that beauty and death were always neighbors in the Renaissance. You find yourself standing near a statuette of the few erected not for kings or martyrs, but for a healer, a woman, robed simply, holding a bowl in one hand and a scroll in the other. Her name is lost to time, but the base of the statue carries this inscription: "To those who tried, even when they failed." You sit on the low stone wall nearby. The air is cool now. You hear footsteps echo across a distant bridge. A gondolier hums a lullaby to himself, and you think about all the healers who came before the science. The ones who mixed herbs and mercury, who prayed over fevers, who honestly tried to save people in a world where medicine was often closer to faith than fact. You close your eyes for a moment. The statue doesn't move. The stars don't blink. But somehow, the silence feels kind. The next morning creeps in slowly, as though the city itself isn't sure it wants to wake. Thin fingers of light press through mist along the river, dappling cracked stone walls and empty piazzas with a sleepy kind of gold. You stir from your bench near the healer's statue, spine aching, limbs stiff. But you don't rush to stand. The hush of the city at dawn is a rare kind of music, and after a night like that, you understand why some people never speak their suffering out loud. Sometimes, just being here is enough. You make your way back through quieter alleys, toward the ancient hospital you glimpsed yesterday. In daylight, it seems smaller, but the stories it holds are enormous. Inside is a long hall with arched ceilings, where frescoes of saints and angels peer down as if they've been watching for centuries. You're not here for them, though. You're here for the gallery of faces. Mainstream fact: in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, several European cities began to document patients with peculiar symptoms: facial collapse, body lesions, delirium that modern historians now attribute to late-stage syphilis. These records included paintings, woodcuts, and even small sculpture busts preserved in anatomical collections. Some were medical in nature, others were meant to scare. The gallery you enter is dim and silent. Along the walls, painted panels of Renaissance patients, most anonymous, each one shown in stages of decline. It's not gruesome, just profoundly sad. One woman holds a baby. Her eyes are gentle, but her skin is cracking at the jawline. A man in scholar's robes stares forward blankly, as though something inside him has already fled. One panel shows a trio: mother, daughter, and priest, all infected, all holding hands. You linger on that one the longest. You move to the far end of the hall. There's a mirror there, not original, not ancient, but installed deliberately. When you look into it, your face reflects among theirs. It's meant to remind visitors, this isn't a closed story. Illness doesn't live in one century. It haunts all of them. Quirky tidbit: some apothecaries, unable to treat syphilis, pivoted to selling talisman amulets shaped like figs, snakes, or ears meant to absorb illness or misfortune. One popular charm in Venice bore the inscription, "I carry your silence." No one really knew what it meant, but patients bought them anyway. Historians still argue whether the syphilis that exploded in Renaissance Europe was truly new, or merely a mutation of an older, milder disease that had existed unnoticed. Some link it to the Columbian exchange sailors bringing a new strain from the Americas. Others say it emerged from the swamps of Italy itself, born of overcrowded cities, poor sanitation, and human desperation. The truth? Like so many things in history, it's tangled and unsolved. You leave the hall behind and step back into the street. People are waking up now. A fruit vendor sings as he arranges his figs. A nun sweeps a doorway. A child runs barefoot through puddles, laughing. Life doesn't stop for disease. It never has. Even in the darkest chapters of history, the world insists on moving forward. You pass a bakery, and the smell of rising bread stops you in your tracks. Your stomach growls. The plague might have ravaged bodies, but it never touched bread, and thank goodness for that. You buy a small roll, still warm, and find a step to sit on. You eat quietly, watching the city yawn to life. And that's when it hits you not like a fact, but like a feeling. For all the horror of syphilis, for all the pain it caused, and the ignorance that let it spread, There was something deeply human in how people responded. They didn't just suffer, they adapted. They loved anyway. They tried anyway. They carved their prayers into stone. They whispered to statues. They painted their fear on panels. And they kept going. Maybe that's the real story of Renaissance syphilis. Not just a disease that disfigured faces and ruined kings, but a disease that laid bare how fragile, how brave, and how hopeful people can be. Even when they're terrified, even when they're told there's no cure. You finish your bread and dust your hands. The sun's risen fully now. Birds argue in the eaves. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rings out once, soft and low. It's time to go. You take one last look at the buildings around you, layered with history, filled with stories no textbook ever tells. And as you walk away, you carry those stories with you, not to fix them, not to solve them, just to remember. Because memory is a kind of medicine, too. And now, as the last echoes of cobbled footsteps and crumbling frescoes begin to fade, you let your breath settle. The cities of the past so vivid just a moment ago recede gently into the background, like watercolor soaked into old parchment. You were there, among them. You walked their streets, sat in their shadowed chapels, brushed your fingertips over the edges of their silence. It's all quiet now. Imagine the soft flicker of candlelight on aged stone, the creak of an apothecary's cabinet in the wind, the warmth of morning bread between your palms, fresh from a Renaissance hearth. You are safe. You are still. The stories are resting. Let your mind soften, like linen warmed by sun. You remember the ears carved into stone feet, the whispered hopes in mercury-scented rooms, the sighs left behind in quarantine halls. You don't need to solve their mystery tonight. You only need to let them rest beside you, like folded notes on a bedside table, forgotten but never unloved. Feel the weight of your body now, how the bed holds you gently, how the air wraps around you like silk. There is nothing more to do, no more kings to chase, no more symptoms to name, just the slow rhythm of your breath, the steady quiet of sleep approaching. The Renaissance can wait. Tonight, you are heard, and that's enough.